Hey guys, it's Miharu. Before we get into anything, I must clearly state that this is a response video to Canadian Guy's theory about the next Spyro installment, and how the Winter Guardian Spyro skin from Nitro Fueled might hint at it, so please watch his video first if you haven't already. First off, he points out that we now have essentially two forms of Spyro that relate to Ice Breath. That in itself seems redundant, and why would Activision put such focus on this Grand Prix skin above all others? Next, he puts emphasis on the fact that it's specifically called the Winter Guardian Spyro skin, and the reason this is important is because of the homeworlds in 2 and 3 both having seasonal themes or aesthetics. In fact, one could argue that, to some extent, this is even reflected in the first game's homeworlds. Artisans could represent spring, Peacekeepers is hot like summer, and Magic Crafters has snow like winter. Basically, it's no secret that seasons are a big part of the iconic look that Spyro worlds are known for. Finally, he puts out his theories. 1. This could be the new Ice Breath power-up appearance in general, replacing the old one. Fine, but it doesn't explain why it looks so drastically different than the others. Up until this point, it's only been colors and patterns that have changed. This one almost doesn't look like Spyro. His horns have become antlers, his hair spines are gone, and there are spikes on the tip of his tail. Beautiful, but strange. Number 2. This could symbolize Spyro taking his ice powers to the next level. This points to the possibility of him mastering different breaths. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's very much like A New Beginning, in which he had to master the 4 elements, with the help of the 4 elemental guardians. Which leads me to number 3. The reason for the skin's name might be because Spyro is chosen to protect and become a guardian of a winter-themed homeworld, and by extent, other worlds based on different seasons, which give him corresponding breath abilities. I realize this is a lot to take in, and all I'm doing is reiterating these theories and giving my own insight. In my opinion, 2 and 3 sound the most likely to happen, if this is indeed a tease to the next game's concept. However, because I know there will be a ton of people screaming about it in the comments, I suppose I should bring this up. Yes, there is a slight chance that this could be hinting at a remake, or at the very least, a brand new game with elements of Season of Ice. Now, before you dislike this video and shout how we don't need any more remakes and that this is a stupid idea, let me explain something. Whenever someone proposes the idea of a true Spyro 4, one of the most common things they mention is that it should pick up where Year of the Dragon left off. Season of Ice already does this, canonically taking place right after the Sorceress's defeat and having out-of-work Rhinox return as enemies. But what's even more interesting to note is the story of the sequel, Season of Flame. Spyro, Sparks, Hunter, and Bianca return from their vacation in Dragon Shores after having helped the Fairy Realm. When they arrive, they're informed by an Elder Dragon that an army of Rhinox, led by Ripto, have attacked the Dragon Realms once again and have stolen the Fireflies. Without Firefly magic, dragons can't breathe fire, replacing the fire with ice. This game puts a heavy focus on Ice Breath, so using the concept of Winter Guardian Spyro would make perfect sense. With all the hype that's been generated by Nitro Fueled over the past year, and the highly anticipated release of the 2020 title, can Spyro even hope to catch up to Crash? To better explain what I mean with that question, let us first take a look at where the two series stand at the moment. As stated, Nitro Fueled has been going strong for almost a year and continues to keep us on our toes with brand new content every month. We have a possible PS5 launch title to look forward to, and even before that, we're getting a mobile game. With all this news, it's almost hard to remember a time when we weren't hearing speculations about Crash left and right. So where is Spyro in all of this? Well, to say it's been left completely in the dust would be untrue. The community continues to make awesome mods for Reignited on PC, and Spyro himself is certainly still getting attention in CTR, so the series is definitely still relevant. I touched on this topic briefly back before Reignited was released, wondering whether it could possibly be a bigger deal than Insane. In that video, I stated that while Crash kinda dropped off the map after Mind Over Mutant in 2008, Spyro needed to be rescued from the Skylanders series, which people labeled as a fate worse than death. In other words, Insane was a revival. Reignited was supposed to be a savior. And it sort of was, if you choose to see it that way. Academy was cancelled after its third season, and Ring of Heroes kind of fell into obscurity. I'm not sure if Reignited necessarily had anything to do with that, but that's what happened. It's important to note that, due to Spyro being 2 years younger than Crash, it will always be a step behind. There aren't as many games in general, and as far as I'm aware, none of them has ever sold as well as Crash titles. Of course, there could be a multitude of reasons for that I don't really want to get into, but it is interesting to think about. Now, I realize this is beginning to sound like I'm complaining that Spyro isn't as popular when it rightfully should be, but I digress. That's just the way it goes sometimes. A sister series won't always get the same kind of attention as what preceded it. But the question here is it even possible for our Purple Dragon to receive a game that acknowledges, celebrates, and preserves his past as much as Nitro Fuel does for Crash? Could it happen, and should it happen? It comes as no surprise that the two franchises share very similar histories. They both had their highs, lows, and in-betweens. And this sort of goes back to what I was saying about the difference between the remakes and what they represented. The PS2 era of Crash was definitely flawed in many areas, but there was always something about it that still felt like Crash. The main cast remained largely the same with a few new additions, and there was a tonal shift with the characters' personalities being more exaggerated, and humor in general playing a bigger role. But a lot of that ended up becoming a staple, and to everyone except the Naughty Dog era purists, it's still recognized as Crash. And then you have Spyro, which instead of getting spin-offs, went in a completely different direction with both a continuity reboot and a hard reboot, which again is considered by many to not even be part of the series at this point. So with that in mind, could it happen? Well, there could easily be a game that includes nods to Spyro's past, even Reignited has its fair share of references, but aside from images, a name drop here and there, and maybe every different ability being available, I just don't see lesser known characters like Ember or Flame or full levels from any of the PS2 era games being present. And we have to think of it this way too. CTR is a spin-off, which is why I can afford to get away with things like that and make it feel natural. Spyro has always been a very controlled series, doesn't have experience with branching out in the same way. Kart racers and party games are not its thing, and I truly cannot see something like that catching on. So no, maybe Spyro will never catch up to Crash. Not in the same way, at least. He has his own path to follow, and we can only hope that 2021 will bring us something fresh and interesting. Should Ripto return as the main antagonist of a new Spyro game? This is something I come across a lot when it comes to comments mentioning a brand new Spyro game. Whether people want the next installment to be a remake of Enter the Dragonfly or not, many people will say that they want Ripto, or any of the three original villains for that matter, to make a return. Maybe even expand on that team-up that was teased in the Spyro 3 epilogue, regardless of canonicity. And I'm just not sure that should happen. At this point, I'm still holding out hope that Ripto will make it into CTR, never mind a new game. And no, it has nothing to do with the fact that he couldn't possibly have survived the lava. Come on, if that's your only counterpoint, then you've really got nothing. No, it's because the idea frightens me. I mean, the last time he came back, it was, well, pretty much a disaster. And not just due to the mishandled mess that Enter the Dragonfly turned out to be. It's often forgotten that he came back first in Season of Flame, which was released not 2 months prior. But because the former was a mainline console game, that's what's stuck in our minds. If I were to ask you who Spyro's arch nemesis is, what would your answer be? Some of you might say Nasty Nork, which is understandable. He's quite fondly remembered as the original villain, and the reason why Spyro began his adventures and became the hero of the Dragon Worlds. And he is the one who made it into CTR first. However, excluding cameos, he's only made 2 major appearances in the series, that being the first game and A Hero's Tale. You see, unlike other video game protagonists like Crash, Link, or Mario, Spyro never technically had a set archenemy. The closest equivalent to a Cortex, Ganon, or Bowser for him would be Ripto. At 5 major appearances, he's definitely the most popular and well-known villain of the series. So with that in mind, it's no wonder why he'd be many's first choice for a return. He'd also be my first choice, if I didn't fear the consequences. Now, I'm not saying if that happens that the result will automatically end up like Enter the Dragonfly. Regardless of whether or not the next game is a remake, what I'm truly afraid of is his popularity going so far to the point where he becomes milked, and in the process nearly ceases to be the character I liked in the first place. And though the Spyro series no longer belongs to Insomniac, something like this has already happened with another antagonist of theirs. Yes, I'm of course speaking of Dr. Nefarious from the Ratchet & Clank series, who, like Ripto, has become the pseudo-arch-nemesis to Ratchet in recent years due to his immense popularity. So much so to the point where the reboot basically tossed the original first game villain aside in favor of him. Like, imagine if Reignited was a reboot, and Toys for Bob decided Nasty Nork wasn't important anymore, so they lazily worked Ripto into the story just to have him be the final boss instead. That's what it felt like. Can you sorta see why this upsets me? When it comes to characters I care about a lot, of course I want to see them treated with the respect they deserve. With recurring characters, especially villains, I like to savor their appearances. Each time they show up, it should feel special, meaningful. I know they say you can never have too much of a good thing, and I always appreciate my favorites receiving attention, but I'd rather enjoy their fewer appearances than roll my eyes over too many. On that note, would I like to see Ripto return as a main antagonist? Yes, but later down the line, so not to risk damaging his reputation or diminishing the quality of his character like Enter the Dragonfly did. That said, I would not, however, be completely against an updated version of a lesser-known villain making a comeback to the series. Red, or the Sorcerer, are the most likely candidates, but it's a bit of a long shot. Ideally, I'd want a brand new villain with a unique design and motive, something we've never seen before to give Toys for Bob a chance to show us what they can do with this revival without relying on the classic series too heavily. Should Spyro be older in the next game? So the idea for this video actually came while I was scrolling through Twitter. A couple people had noticed that the official Spyro the Dragon account retweeted a piece of fan art by artist Taran Fiddler, depicting their rendition of Nicholas Cole's version of adult Spyro. Now, before y'all start jumping on me and saying it doesn't mean anything, I never said it did. I'm just telling you what inspired me to make this video. But it is interesting to note either way, since it seems quite out of the ordinary for the official Twitter to go around retweeting very specific fan art at such a random time. And that's what the community is all about, picking up on what we see as strange and cryptic behavior. But whether it means anything or not, back to my initial question. Should Spyro be older in the next game? Not necessarily an adult, just aged up. Some of you might really like the idea, as it's very reminiscent of the Legend series, which showed Spyro growing up throughout the course of the story. However, others may be opposed to this for the very same reason. As for me, while it's an interesting concept, I don't know if it'll work with a classic-styled Spyro game like the original trilogy, providing that's the direction they take. Not saying a time skip couldn't work, it just might be a bit jarring to suddenly be playing as an adult Spyro with no real explanation. And let's remember that one of the concept designs for Spyro was an adult dragon. There was a reason they opted to go with the smaller, cuter look we're all familiar with. The only way I can really see that happening is if they incorporate some sort of back and forth time travel aspect, something along the lines of Ocarina of Time. Or perhaps Spyro is sent into the future, or alternatively, adult Spyro is sent back into the past, and the two Spyros fight alongside each other to defeat a new evil. I don't know. While it would be fun to see, executing it is another thing altogether. The Purple Dragon is very much an ageless protagonist. Yes, you can argue his naivete in the first game made him appear younger, but from Ripto's Rage onward up until the reboot, he's pretty much forever 10, or 12. And whether that's due to the change in voice actor or not, it's clear that his personality at least developed over time. I guess it comes down to what kind of protagonists we prefer, or did prefer in our childhood. Those we saw ourselves in and liked to watch grow as we ourselves did, or those who remain unchanged. Essentially a palette for any new generation to project themselves onto. This also allows for anyone to pick up the series at any point and enjoy it without needing to get the full story. That said, if you don't care either way, then it doesn't really matter. Personally, it's never mattered all that much to me whether a character ages physically to show the passage of time, even though in some ways it places a generic label on them and may give the impression that nothing in their world ever changes and therefore the gameplay around them is doomed to repetition. I'm perfectly fine with Spyro being one of those characters who stays the same. Before we end off, I want to quickly discuss the difference between Nicholas Cole's adult Spyro and the one that was shown in the original Spyro 1 manual. Aside from the difference in design, the original one looking more like an elder, I'd like to point out the medal, signifying his accomplishments and everything he's done for the Dragon Worlds. It's possible that, at this point in his life, he's resigned from his hero duties and instead becomes a mentor to a new generation of dragons. and the story continues with them trying to follow in his footsteps and live up to his legacy. Should the Legend of Spyro series be remade or continue? As I watch different videos, I come across people who want Legend to return in the form of a remake, to which I say, maybe, but I just don't know if that would work, because it already looks fine as it is, doesn't it? The only thing I can imagine being updated is the animations and character models, but for a PS2 game, it still looks pretty good by today's standards, just like Jak and Daxter does. And on top of that, there's another thing not many people talk about. If Legend is remade, should the story continue afterward? Now, I know some of you may be thinking, what's the point of remaking or continuing the story of the reboot now that we have Reignited and the classic series back? Why would they skip around and not stick with that? And that's a valid question. Spyro is sort of at a point now where we don't quite know what direction it could take. It actually reminds me of where Ratchet & Clank stands at the moment. Will they continue the reboot storyline at this point, or go from where Nexus left off? It can go either way for that series, but in Spyro's case, it's highly likely Toys for Bob will go the safe route and continue to come up with new ideas for the classic series. Unlike the original trilogy, which was made up of more or less standalone games and had little to do with each other in terms of story, Legend of course had one overarching plot which wrapped up at the end of Dawn of the Dragon. Or did it? Personally, I always found it a bit confusing. At first glance, it seems clear that Spyro sacrificed himself to rebuild the dying world, though the chronicler is unable to find his name amongst the records of dragons who have died. We then see Spyro and Cynder flying together in the Valley of Avalar. So, what is the truth? Did they survive? Are they residing in some kind of spiritual realm? It's never really explained, and due to this vague ending, it's hard to imagine how exactly it could go on. But there is another option. Who said the legend had to continue with a sequel? Think about just how interesting a prequel could be, and the directions it could take. We could get to play as a young Malefor and get a closer look at what corrupted him and led him to become the Dark Master. We could get to know the other Guardians that supposedly lost their lives in the war with Malefor's forces. Hell, we could even get a chance to see who Spyro's real parents were. There are so many possibilities that I think would make for a great series of games. So first off, could it happen? Yes. Say at some point down the line with the PS5, we get some kind of remastered Legend Trilogy collection. Not necessarily a Reignited style ground-up remake, but closer to a port. Bringing the series back in some way would give developers a window of opportunity to continue the story if they so choose. Next, should it happen? Again, not right now, but perhaps sometime in the future it could end up being beneficial. Should fairies have a larger role in upcoming Spyro games? You know, for as prominent as they are in the series, the fairies of the Spyro universe don't get nearly enough recognition. One could even say they're just as important as the dragons themselves, appearing in almost every classic title as well as Skylanders. It's actually quite surprising that none of the games have ever taken the time to really focus on them and explore their history and relationship with the other creatures of the Dragon Worlds, Forgotten Worlds, and Avalar. I mean, think about the incredibly wide range of abilities these characters have. Granting you elemental powers, upgrading your flame to super flame, creating whirlwinds, saving your game, pointing you in the right direction when you get lost. Well, my point is they do have a lot of potential, and giving them a bigger role could greatly benefit the more major fairy characters such as Zoe or Princess Ami. Would love to see how things are going with her and Azrael. So what kind of opportunities could be presented by doing this? Well, for one, we could get the chance to return to the fairy realm from Season of Ice, which is said to be the true home of Zoe. As each of the homeworlds are themed after seasons, I imagine it's quite similar to Avalar, which would explain why some of the fairies chose to make a home there. Next, if this were to happen, we could even get Zoe herself as a playable character. Going off on a tangent, I don't think she's given enough credit when put next to more popular female characters like Elora or Bianca. Yes, she's basically just a checkpoint and tutorial guide with no clear personality traits, but maybe this new timeline can fix that. As we saw in Reignited, she knows when she's needed and won't hesitate to help out a friend in trouble. And even going back to something in the original, what exactly was she whispering to Elora in this scene? Did she have knowledge of Ripto or his kind prior to these events? It's little things like this that could very well be expanded upon further. So, should it happen? Absolutely, in my opinion. I would hate for such an iconic species in the series to go to waste when there's so much we can learn about them. And I think it would be quite interesting to get some more interaction between Spyro and the creatures who have been there with him since the beginning of his journey. As Mudata told us, fairies are always on our side. Now, could it happen? Well, anything's possible at this point, and I'm not going to say it's quite as unlikely as something like my Dark Bianca theory, but between this and a completely fresh concept with a new world and new characters, I'd say the latter is more probable in the long run. However, I still believe it's a solid idea with a ton of promise that Toys for Bob, or whoever the developers may be in the future, would enjoy tackling. Oh my god, it hasn't even been a week since Crash 4 was announced and you're already talking about Spyro again? Stop trying to compare the two, they're apples and oranges, blah blah blah. First of all, it's still the primary focus of my channel, and second, what better time than now to discuss how the next Spyro game could be affected by this. This also gives me the opportunity to bring up the title of Crash 4. I personally still believe this to be an odd decision. Yeah, calling it Crash 8 would have been even weirder, but I guess the concept of slapping a number on it at this point is what confuses me. And I get it, it's supposed to be a true sequel to Warped, whereas Wrath of Cortex was standalone, despite it being known as Crash 4 in Japan. But this decision has led people to assume that Wrath of Cortex is being retconned, which isn't true. As you can see from this excerpt taken from Canadian Guy's interview with Paul Yan, It's About Time is all about alternate timelines and realities. The PS2 games did happen, and they won't be forgotten just because a title with an official number on it told us so. But anyway, back to Spyro. Now that we have a true Crash 4, will there be a true Spyro 4? How will that work? Well, again, the reason Crash 4 has that name is because it's a direct sequel, which Wrath of Cortex wasn't exactly. However, in Spyro's case, we sort of had that already. In fact, in my eyes, we had it twice. The first instance is, of course, what we all know as Spyro 4, despite it never having that title, Enter the Dragonfly, which picks up directly from where You're the Dragon left off. The second, and what led to some confusion for me as a kid, was Season of Ice, which was released the year prior. See, as a kid, it didn't occur to me that there were mainline games and spin-off games. It came after 3, so I called it 4. Plus, the premise of Spyro, Hunter, and Bianca taking a vacation sounded enough like sequel material to me. So, where does that leave us? On one hand, this could be our chance to actually get an official Spyro 4, though if it's gonna take any cues from Enter the Dragonfly, it might as well just be a remake. But that's not what we should be getting. We waited 12 years for Crash to receive a brand new game, and boy did Toys for Bob deliver. So obviously, we deserve an entirely new entry to the Spyro series as well. It's easy for Crash 4 to get away with having that title without decanonizing the other games because it deals with separate timelines. But can Spyro do that too? I mean, it was hinted at that the Purple Dragon could be making an appearance. I wonder if that will have anything to do with his next game. Will we be getting a Spyro 4 that's a replacement for Enter the Dragonfly? Or will it just be an alternate continuity where the events of the classic series after the trilogy still happened? The concept of multiverses seems to be all the rage these days, so it's not completely outside of the realm of possibility for Spyro to get a similar treatment. Now, how something like that would work is anybody's guess. Perhaps the professors experimenting with portals went too far and, well, who knows. We could get a playable Ripto, a badass alternate universe version of Allura, and even Cynder could make an appearance. When it comes to lore regarding the dragons of the Spyro universe, the original trilogy isn't the best at answering questions. We know they were banished from the Forgotten Realms over 1,000 years ago by the Sorceress, and from there made a home in what we now know as the Dragon Realms, but that's about it. Nothing about just how many dragons actually exist, where all the females are, or what other worlds they could be inhabiting. The first question can be answered by doing a little math, which tells us there are around 240 dragons currently occupying the Dragon Realms. From the first game, the 74 elders and 12 eggs, which are presumably hatched by now, the 151 from the third, 150 eggs, but 151 dragons since the last one was twins, and Spyro himself. As of now, we have no information on female elders, so that still remains a mystery, but I think I know where we could possibly be seeing some, which brings me to the third question. We actually do know of at least one other place that has dragons, Ripto's world. And judging by the fact that he could immediately smell there were none in Avalar, there must have been a lot where he came from. And while we still don't know the real reason he hates them so much, aside from the implication that they picked on him in school as revealed by his bio in the Gateway to Glimmer manual, it's possible the dragons in his world were different than the ones we've gotten to know. Were they just plain mean, or distrustful of the Riptok species? After after the shade Lindar threw at Nasty Nork, I wouldn't be surprised. What sort of things have they experienced living there? And what sort of things might Spyro experience if he ends up going there? Perhaps these are questions that will be answered in the next game. Personally, I'm very on the fence about the idea of Ripto making a return. However, being able to see the world he came from, that might be interesting. It would be a great opportunity to give us all kinds of new information, both about the dragons and Ripto himself. Was it their land that he took over, or the other way around? Also, it might be a nice change of pace to see a group of dragons portrayed as the villains instead of the one went rogue story that was used for Red and Malifor. And that's not to say it would turn Ripto into a misunderstood character that was actually a good guy all along by any means. I'm saying that in his world, maybe everyone has problems. Hey guys, it's Miharu, and with just 1 month to go until the release of Crash 4 It's About Time, it's no surprise that the hype is rising. But along with the excitement building up to the release of a new game comes anxiety as well. Will it live up to our expectations? Will it deliver on everything it's promised? There's no way to know for sure. And we all have different ideas about what makes a game good, but we also all have hopes. And after seeing so many people talk about what exactly they want to see from Crash 4, I figured it's time to share 5 things I personally want to see in a new Spyro game, which we might possibly be getting sometime next year. Number 1. Returning characters. If this is to be not only a proper sequel to Year of the Dragon, but the original trilogy as a whole, I would like to see a good amount of fan favorites, at least the protagonists like Hunter of course, Bianca, and especially Allura, to return and be given bigger roles that make them more essential to the plot or gameplay. For example, Hunter can have playable sections like in Hero's Tale, Bianca can use her magic to upgrade Spyro's abilities and not, disappear completely after doing one thing, and as for Allura, well, at this point I'd be happy if she's just in the game as more than a cameo. Honestly, anything goes as far as she's concerned. Personally, I hope they go the Tawna route and turn her into a badass leader type. And on the topic of playable villains, while I would love to play as Ripto for a nice parallel to Crash 4, I'm still unsure if he should come back just yet. Number 2, a focus on exploration. As we know, various minigame missions were added to 2 and 3 in order to give the gameplay more variety. And while it is a staple of these games and I couldn't ask it be removed completely, I would very much like to see a return to the first game style of platforming around a big world, discovering hidden areas, and finding secrets. It really made you feel like you were on a grand adventure in a mysterious and magical land. Along with that, I'd also like to see a greater focus on puzzle solving that requires the use of different abilities, magic or otherwise. Imagine something like Zelda or Star Fox Adventures but with Spyro, or even something that was already done with Spyro like Dawn of the Dragon, except without the combat part. Keep in mind, I still want them to stick to the core formula. Hub worlds, portals to levels, NPCs to chat with. I want it to still feel like Spyro while switching things up a little. Number 3, an engaging story. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Miharu, they did that with the Legend series, and you've said in the past that's the whole reason you don't like it as much. And while it's true, I didn't really like the idea of turning Spyro into Lord of the Rings, having an interesting plot isn't a bad thing. The original trilogy is very basic, with the closest thing we get to an actual story with any depth being in Year of the Dragon. But hey, that is my favorite of the 3. So it's not like I'm opposed to story, I just don't want it to try and be something it's not. The future saga of Ratchet and Clank did this very well in my opinion. It went a different route, but never lost its charm. What I want here is simple. The villain is introduced, they do something evil, the audience has questions, and we learn throughout the course of the game why certain things are happening, what the villain's motive is, and what we need to do to stop it. But instead of Spyro being a bystander thrown into this mess against his will, I want him to be directly affected by it. See, Spyro's always been sort of a blank slate for the player to put themselves in the shoes or feet of. And while that's fine, many mascot characters are like that, I sometimes feel that the games treat him as an afterthought, when he should be getting just as much of the focus as the others. Going off of that, I would really like it if we were given little tidbits of lore around the worlds we were exploring, just to give us a little bit more of an incentive to want to help the inhabitants. Number 4, a new world. See, if it is a direct sequel to Year of the Dragon, it's highly likely the game will begin in the Dragon Realms. However, I don't believe it should remain there, to differentiate from Enter the Dragonfly. While it did give us new locations to give the feeling of exploring an unknown part of the Dragon Realms, I think it ended up making things more confusing in the long run, especially with the Hero's Tale's Dragon Kingdom. I believe a Spyro 4 should firmly establish that the setting of Spyro 1 is indeed the same setting as Enter the Dragonfly, which we have, of course, already explored. And unless they go the Silent Hill route and take our journey through some dark, twisted version of a familiar location, I don't think there's any need to explore it again. Now, as for what this new world I'm proposing could be, well, I don't know. In the past, I've talked about the possibility of seeing an updated fairy realm from Season of Ice, or even getting to visit Ripto's world. Something we've never seen before would be ideal. Or alternatively, since the concept of portal hopping is so popular these days, it could allow us to see a variety of areas, both old and new. And number 5, a good reward. The 100% rewards for the original trilogy have always been hit and miss, with the Infinite Super Flame from 2 being my favorite, and the extra cutscene from 3 being my least favorite. In my personal opinion, the best rewards are New Game Plus modes, which of course allow for replayability, or overpowered weapons or abilities that let you just have fun. I have seen a ton of comments asking for permanent free flight, and all I could say is, if they could find a way to make it work, then sure. All I can hope for is a bonus round that doesn't force us to do all the things we hated doing in the main game. I mean, it's a reward. It should be relaxing and enjoyable. Let's talk about free flight. Free flight, or super flight, has been a thing since the very first Spyro game. They're the flight levels and speedways that give it to you for time trial challenges, you get it in bonus levels like Nasty's loot in the super bonus round, and of course, it's a power-up that you use for various tasks. To put it simply, it's always been more of a power-up or one-level-only reward than something that's actually part of your moveset. The first game to make it that way was Dawn of the Dragon, the third entry in the Legend of Spyro series, and even then, it wasn't implemented in the best way. For one, you were tethered to another character, which hindered your speed and made everything feel sluggish, and then there was a cap on how high you could actually fly, so a lot of it felt pointless. It was fun for a while, but ultimately was not ideal. So, for permanent superflight to work in a classic-style Spyro game, it could go one of two ways. The first, and what most people would probably agree on, is to have it be a reward for 100% completion. However, while it does sound like a fun idea in theory, you have to take into consideration what sort of value it would actually have. Sure, it would be cool to fly around, possibly getting out of bounds like a swim and air glitch, but that's about it. And even if you were to apply it to New Game Plus, it still wouldn't have much use. I know people like to say Super Flame from Spyro 2 was a lame reward, mostly because they weren't aware they could restart the game with it intact, but it at least added something to the gameplay, with it essentially being a weapon. In order for Superflight to add any sort of replay value, content within the game would have to be altered or added upon starting up a new mode. And keep in mind, I'm basing this off of what we know from the original trilogy's level structure. If Spyro 4 were to have a more open world design or new modes that allow for that sort of thing, then it wouldn't be as much of an issue. Another way it could work is to have it be an upgradable ability. Say you start out with your glide like normal, but as you progress, you can acquire upgrades which eventually turn that glide into full flight. This idea assumes that later levels will have a design built around this mechanic so it can work. Though, if something like this is done for every ability, that would result in the removal of power-up gates, which is a risky decision as they're quite iconic Spyro gameplay elements. So in that case, I'm thinking something like Banjo-Kazooie with its flight pads. You're not on a time limit, but it lasts only until you touch the ground. Now imagine Spyro did that. You go through a gate and have unlimited flight until you land. In Banjo, of course, you use feathers to fly higher, but Spyro wouldn't need that. And to make it fair, these power-ups would only appear after killing a certain number of enemies or reaching the end of the level. Permanent free flight is definitely a debatable topic, and proper implementation can be tough without making it seem pointless or OP. You know, it seems everywhere I look, whether it's a big fan of the series or not, there's always someone making a remark about Spyro's level of difficulty. Either they say it should be more like Crash, or they simply say it should have harder bosses or something. And to the former, look, I'm aware Spyro isn't the most challenging of games compared to something like Crash, but why is that a bad thing? What's wrong with it being a more chill, easygoing experience? That's what I've always liked about it. And it's not like it doesn't have its challenges, they just come in the form of tedious minigames. And in Legend of Spyro's case, look no further than the Eternal Night with its unnecessarily hard combat. However, that's not to say the challenge can't be updated or implemented in a way that feels natural to Spyro. Remember, Reignited almost had difficulty settings, and though I don't know for certain exactly what that would have entailed, I can only guess it would have involved something like reducing the amount of hit points for sparks, removing fodder, enemies that take more hits depending on the setting, just basic things like that. And then there was the adaptive difficulty in the original Year of the Dragon, which is what made bosses like Spike so hard to defeat. Difficulty in Spyro's case shouldn't mean having to replay the same levels over and over to get all the collectibles in one go, or going through the level as fast as possible without dying. And I don't want to be racing a boss around treetops on a hoverboard while avoiding obstacles. It should simply be a test of your platforming skills and being observant of your surroundings to find secrets and hidden gems. Something to make you think, like what the first game had going for it, with the flight levels as a bit of a bonus challenge. And I'm not saying Crash doesn't have that, it just happens to also have a lot of unnecessary stuff that, in my opinion, shouldn't be required for completion. A game shouldn't need to be infuriating or cause physical pain to the player to be held in high regard or be labeled as a quality experience. Out of all my favorite games, not one of them can I say was a breeze the entire way through. All of them had at least one moment I got frustrated with. That said, what should we get in Spyro 4? Difficulty settings? Adaptive difficulty? Just making it a slightly harder game in general? I'll leave that up for you guys to discuss in the comments below. Hey guys, it's Miharu, and the announcement for the next Spyro game is upon us. I can feel it. But until that day comes, I guess we'll just have to keep speculating and discussing what exactly we want to see and how a new game could work. I've gone over a few topics here on my Future of Spyro series, from my top 5 hopes to questioning if the game should be more difficult, but I've yet to go into detail about what Spyro 4 could actually do to improve upon the formula set by the original trilogy. Spyro has always followed a fairly basic, linear but not too linear structure. You have a task of getting from point A to point B, but aside from certain levels that put you on a strict path, the areas have always been open for exploration, letting you choose which way you wanted to go first. A perfect example of this is one of the very first levels, Stone Hill. As soon as you arrive, you have the option to go straight for the exit portal. But all it takes is one look around and you start thinking, maybe I'll check out the rest of the area. And suddenly that turns into, what is that annoying taunting noise? And where is the key to this chest? It has its own subtle way of luring you into its world, enticing you to explore further. Spyro 1 especially has always been the definition of more than meets the eye. 2 and 3, of course, as we know, focused less on the platformer aspect and more on earning your rewards through a variety of minigames in order to keep things fresh, while still retaining a few pure platforming segments and hidden areas here and there. So the question is, how can this be expanded upon in Spyro 4? Personally, while I'd very much prefer a return to Spyro 1's style, I don't think the challenges of the latter games should be thrown out completely. At this point, they've become a staple, along with features such as multiple playable characters. These challenges can, however, be more cleverly implemented into the worlds without feeling like intrusive progression blockers. Something like helping the gem cutters light their lamps? Alright. Protecting cavemen from getting eaten by dinosaurs? Fine. A random game of whack-a-mole? What does that have to do with Crystal Islands? It's things like this that bug me. Give me side missions that actually make sense, and even if they don't, at least make them fun. Another much-needed change would be proper utilization for Spyro's forgotten abilities, like the roll or the wing shields from Enter the Dragonfly. It's just, why unify the roll across all 3 games in Reignited if you're not going to use it for anything? And the shield is only needed for 1 level, and even then, half the time it doesn't even work right. So what was the reason? And going off of that, give us better and more intricate uses for power-ups as well. Mostly referring to Year of the Dragon here, but I don't want to use Supercharge just to chase down fast thieves, or Super Flame just to break some pots or hit some faraway enemies, not counting the combo power-ups where it seems to work best. I mean, how many times did we get Super Flame in Spyro 1? Only twice. both times used for heavily armored enemies that you couldn't defeat by normal means. Which brings me to how important enemies are in this series. They're already unique and have their own quirks. Maybe have combat matter a little more too? Not something that requires too much strategy, and nothing along the lines of Legend's repetitive button mashing, but you get what I mean. And back to the topic of power-ups, bring back underused abilities like Super Freeze or the Plasma Bomb. There are so many ways Spyro's moveset can be taken advantage of to make for more interesting gameplay. I talked about it briefly on my last Future of Spyro video, but difficulty is another thing that can be adjusted accordingly as well. And that can be done by tweaking little details, such as making the return home portal matter and removing the option to exit the level, taking away the live system but giving you harsher things to deal with in each world, making collectibles harder to find, nothing too crazy like Crash 4, but something that feels natural to the Spyro series. As you probably know by now, thanks to numerous other videos of mine, Bianca is a character I hold in very high regard, and despite becoming the somewhat token female character in most games throughout the classic series, notably the handheld titles, she doesn't really do much. What's the point of her having cool magical abilities if she's not going to use them for anything other than giving Spyro new breaths, or opening portals, or opening boxes, or cages? Move over, Jill Valentine, we have a new Master of Unlocking. But that's what I mean. She keeps using her powers for the most mundane tasks you can possibly think of. It's boring and it's not fair to her. It's flat out wasted potential, and she could be a much better character if she was allowed. Now, of course, she doesn't have to be playable to have an important role in the story of the next game. Bianca could be very useful behind the scenes as well. After all, she lived in the Forgotten Realms, where the dragons made their home 1,000 years ago. You'd think she would have spent some time studying dragon culture and how things used to be. She might even know things that Spyro doesn't about his kind. Maybe she could act as an assistant to the professor and give Elora something else to do. But imagine, if you will, being able to traverse through mysterious new lands as Bianca, blasting bad guys with magic attacks, creating platforms over bottomless pits, solving her own set of puzzles, or using that flying saucer of hers that's never brought up again. There could even be a moment where she dons her old robe once more to infiltrate the villain's secret base or something. Give her an invisibility cloak for stealth missions, I don't know. Another thing to consider is that she's still in training. Her magic isn't the most powerful, and she wouldn't be able to do a ton at first, but she still does have the spellbook the sorceress gave her, and I could see it being an in-game feature to gather ingredients for new spells, or even materials to craft different types of wands. I'm probably thinking too broad here. Obviously, we want the core gameplay of a Spyro game to focus on Spyro, so it's probably way too much to ask, but it is cool to think about. And even if that's the case, there's still no reason she shouldn't be doing more to help out. Let's even pretend for a second that she somehow lost her wand. What would she do in that situation? Well, being Hunter's girlfriend, I can imagine he probably taught her a few of his own tricks, like how to use a bow. And we know for a fact that she can still use magic without her wand. Hell, in the original, she didn't even have one. So, magic arrows, perhaps? It doesn't even have to be her shooting them. Maybe that's just another way she can be helpful to other characters, by enhancing their abilities. Whatever the case, she definitely needs a more active role. Which character should return in Spyro 4? I've talked a bit about returning characters in previous Future of Spyro episodes, but this video is going to be dedicated solely to briefly discussing which ones fans want to see most, and who could be the most beneficial for a comeback. And remember, this doesn't necessarily mean they should be playable, though I will be going over that as well. Characters like Hunter and Zoe I feel are sort of a given at this point, so I won't be mentioning them. And Bianca, well, I've talked enough about her for now. Let's start with Elora. She has been out of the spotlight for far too long, and I believe she has the potential to be incredibly interesting and serve a bigger role than just story guide. As I've said before, I see her as the acting leader of Avalar, so maybe she can be treated as such, like a leader, like a queen. If playable, I can see her being an archer like Hunter, using kick attacks like Sheila, or using a yo-yo like the Fracture Hills Fawns. Absolutely 100% yes. Next is Cynder. Love or hate her, fact is she's a highly requested character due to the possibility that she could be the Coco to Spyro's crash, meaning you would have the option to play as her through the whole game if you so choose, or at least that she would have a prominent role in the story alongside Spyro. I think reintroducing her to the classic series would be a great way for new fans to get to know her. Ember and Flame, if you ask me, could benefit greatly from an update, but as of now, other than hanging around the Dragon Realms to make the world feel more inhabited and alive, I can't see them contributing to the story much. And if they're not going to do anything, then they're no different than the one-note characters they were in A Hero's Tale. I'm going to say no for now. On the topic of whether or not the critters from Spyro 3 should come back, it would be too much too soon if you ask me. They had their time to shine already as playable characters, and though they could make small cameos as NPCs, I don't even see that happening under normal circumstances, as I doubt the Forgotten Worlds will even be a location in the next game. However, there is another character I'd categorize as a critter, and that's Blink the Mole. Granted, I played very little to none of the games he appeared in, but I wouldn't mind a reimagined version of him showing up to help out both his uncle and Spyro. And then there's the possibility of returning villains. I gave my thoughts about Ripto in another video, which I'll link in the top right, but yeah, I really want a new villain, at least for Spyro 4. When you have a series with no main adversary, it's difficult to single out one to return multiple times without them becoming milked. But anyway, I've said that all before. I also said I wouldn't be fully against Red or the Sorcerer making an appearance, though they'd have to be worked into the story somehow. Bottom line is, I hope the next game feels fresh, with a brand new antagonist and a new world to explore. I want whoever is making this to show us what they can do without having to rely on nostalgia too much. But maybe later down the line we could see Ripto being playable like Cortex or something. When it comes to potential returning characters for the next Spyro game, one of the most highly requested has been Cynder. Making her debut in the Legend of Spyro series, and later appearing in Skylanders, Cynder won many fans over with her story, design, and personality, not to mention her super cool moveset in Dawn of the Dragon. So it's no surprise that people want to see her come back. But now that the classic series is starting anew, how exactly could that work? Obviously, we have no idea what the plot of Spyro 4 will be, so whether or not her backstory is similar is completely based on what ends up happening with that. And rather than talk about how I personally would write the next game or her character, I'm going to focus on how she could be implemented gameplay-wise. Now, the go-to solution is to have her essentially be the Coco to Spyro's crash. Same moves, maybe just tweaked a bit to show the difference between the two character styles. Maybe she could have Lightning Breath as her default, as was depicted in the Skylander series. But as nice as that may sound to some, having the option to play through the entire game as Cynder, I just don't know if that's the way to go. The fact is, this isn't Crash. Spyro should be able to carry most of, if not the entire adventure on his own. I'm not saying the next game should abandon the concept of multiple playable characters completely, cause trust me, there are some I think would work very well, but a majority of the gameplay should be spent with Spyro himself. On the other hand, if Cynder were to be playable only at certain points, there's an even greater chance of her having unique abilities. Out of all the powers she had in Dawn of the Dragon, I think Wind and Shadow would be the most beneficial. Wind would be useful for quickly dealing with groups of smaller enemies, but useless against armored enemies that would be weighed down, whereas Shadow could be used in stealth sections to blend into the walls and get around baddies who can't be killed, a breath that shrouds the area around you in darkness for a short time, or a shadow strike that could be helpful in combat. And on that note, maybe she could have her own power-up gates as well, a more powerful version of whatever her default breath is, with another being only temporary. And you know that green acid bomb ability that Spyro used in his fight against Ripto? Well, another one of Cynder's elements was poison, so if they bring that back, might as well give it to her, either as a power-up or main attack. A few days ago, I proposed the idea of Spyro 4 having a day-night cycle and a level, or levels, similar to that of Fungi Forest from Donkey Kong 64, where the environment and enemies would change based on the time of day. And though it wasn't my intention, I just realized how cool a concept it would be if Cynder were worked into it. Imagine, if you will, adaptive difficulty based on which character you're playing at which time. Spyro, being the light, would be stronger during the day, and Cynder, with her dark powers, stronger at night. Obviously, it would be completely up to the player whether or not to switch them out, because unlike DK64, I don't think there should be a ton of character-based backtracking. But either way, it's a fun idea and something I think could work well. Fourth mainline entries. They're always a mixed bag, aren't they? You could get something that's generally well received, like Crash 4, or you could get, well, something that I like but is critically panned by a majority of fans. So, as we eagerly await a true fourth game for Spyro, I think of everything it could do to be a perfect follow-up to a beloved trilogy. But I can't help but also think of everything that could go horribly wrong. And now, of course, what makes a game good or bad in the eyes of its audience is mostly subjective. Obviously, a glitch-ridden mess with a horrifying development history like Enter the Dragonfly speaks for itself. Games with inexcusable technical issues and little to no effort put in are bad for a reason. That being said, there still exist fans who enjoy Enter the Dragonfly. I mean, even I would play it over the Eternal Night, but that's just me. Games can be bad, or disappointing rather, from both a behind-the-scenes and in-game perspective. Crunch time, clashing developer ideas, story, gameplay, you name it. And those are among the factors that could potentially ruin Spyro 4. For the story, I want continuity, not a soft reboot. It should take place after the events of Year of the Dragon, which, yes, Enter the Dragonfly did, however, do it right this time. You can still have the characters celebrating the baby dragons being back in the Dragon Realms, but do it without relying on a returning villain whose presence is never explained and name-dropping that makes no sense. Referencing Spyro's past adventures should be implemented naturally while still creating a brand new experience. And that's not to say it has to be a huge story either. Now, I do want to see an engaging plot, but when I say that, I just mean something like Spyro 3, not necessarily something along the lines of the Legend series. Simplicity has always been key in these games, and the focus should be on the gameplay that it's known for, collectathon platforming. And speaking of platforming, would be nice to actually have some of that in the next game, wouldn't it? And no, I'm not saying the minigames should be removed completely. They're a staple and all the core elements of the franchise should be preserved. Remember the video I made a while back about how the formula could be improved? That's what I want. First, minigames that make sense. No tank competitions in ancient Egypt, you get me? I won't repeat myself, but basically I talked about consistency, proper utilization of Spyro's forgotten moveset, better use of power-ups and breath abilities, things like that. It needs to take everything we like about the trilogy and tweak or add to it so it feels fresh. On the topic of returning characters, in my opinion, they are a must, but not too many. Just mainstays like Hunter and Bianca, and perhaps someone we haven't seen in a while like Elora. Not Ripto, or any of the previous villains for that matter. We need a new villain with their own motives. And whether or not any of the characters should be playable, I'm not opposed to the idea, but Year of the Dragon could feel a little crowded at times, and I believe the focus should always be on Spyro himself. As for difficulty, I think that should come from the platforming, having to think and figure out how to reach out-of-the-way areas or find secrets instead of tedious trial-and-error missions. And no, we don't need it to be Crash 4 or Dark Souls or Elden Ring or whatever you're saying nowadays. If it can't be enjoyed casually, then it's not Spyro. And the music, oh man, the music. Can we please get something that sounds closer to Copeland's work? And for the love of God, can we get scores that actually fit the tone of the cutscenes instead of this generic, I don't know, cartoon nonsense? I don't know how else to describe it. Bottom line is, Spyro has an identity. It has always put gameplay first. If for any reason Spyro 4 sacrifices that for something like insanely high-quality graphics or a cinematic story that feels like you're playing a Pixar movie, it could really detract from the overall experience. Don't get me wrong, Rift Apart is a fantastic game that does this well, but Spyro doesn't need that. Reignited was just fine with what it brought to the trilogy, and to get something that's just like that, while maybe preserving the charm of the originals a little better than it did, is all I can ask for. When it comes to video game revivals, I agree that evolution is key to helping them stay in the spotlight. Whether it's a remake that relies on nostalgia, or a long-awaited sequel, the end goal is always to appeal to veteran fans as well as find a new audience. It's all about making sure the game gets played, right? Making sure it's a success. And to do that, they must be willing to innovate to keep things fresh and get people interested. So, what does this have to do with Spyro? Well, it's no secret that a lot of us are pretty desperate for a Spyro 4 at this point. But the fact is, its existence is still somewhat of a mystery. When will it be announced? Who's developing it? Is it even being developed at all? And all of this uncertainty still leaves a ton of room for speculation about what direction it could even take. The story, the gameplay, it's completely up in the air. And that's one of the scariest things about this whole situation. We have absolutely no idea what to expect. Spyro, like any franchise, has had its highs and lows. We had the classic series, the Legend trilogy, and Skylanders, which became more of its own thing. And although Legend and Skylanders have their fans, they have one major thing in common. They're not Spyro. At least, not what the original trilogy established. Don't get me wrong, Legend did exactly what it set out to do, which was save the franchise from falling into obscurity. This reboot was essential in keeping the character of Spyro alive during a time where collectathon platformers just weren't a big hit anymore. Things needed to change. I get that. But then came the resurgence. Insane Trilogy, Reignited, Pac-Man World Repack. With these remakes, 3D platformers are back in style, and so many new people are getting to experience these games for the first time, are really enjoying them, and want to see what else they have in store. So why ruin it by changing it up yet again before it's called for? After the success of Insane and Nitrofield, Crash 4 did a wonderful job of testing the waters regarding how a sequel to a 20-plus-year-old game could work. It took the core concept and added to it, built upon it. Yes, it came with its share of flaws, but it still performed quite well, all things considered. And there's no reason Spyro shouldn't be able to do the same, using Crash 4 as a blueprint. You see, it's come to my attention that some people don't want Spyro 4 to follow up on the original trilogy, not just story-wise, but in terms of how it plays. I've heard people say they want it to be an RPG, or a strategy game, or that they want a human character accompanying Spyro. Not only would another reboot at this point in time be a huge slap in the face to fans who have waited 2 decades for something to wash away the sour taste Enter the Dragonfly left us with, but this type of retooling would take away the essence of what we loved about these games in the first place. So, yes, Spyro needs to grow, but twisting it into a completely new concept when we just got reintroduced to the classic gameplay with Reignited? It would render the remake pointless. There's obviously still an audience for 3D platformers. Why deny them this chance to see how much more Spyro can be while still retaining its essence? The last thing we need right now is for the series to have an identity crisis. Again, there's no reason it couldn't improve upon its formula without becoming something it's not. Spyro the Dragon was never the most groundbreaking title. Simple concept, simple execution. And that's all it needed to be. Expanding and broadening its horizons with a sequel can only be a step forward in my eyes. No reason to make it different. Just make it better by taking what it already has to offer and increasing its potential. So, Crash Team Rumble, formerly known as Wumpa League, has now been officially revealed to us. And that's all well and good, but as with any Crash-related announcement, it begs the question, what about Spyro? Now, I don't think we have much to worry about regarding Spyro's appearance in this game. As I and many others have pointed out, the dragon wing amongst the symbols representing all the different characters is pretty telling. I think we can expect something along the lines of the Nitrofield Grand Prix events for Rumble as well. But what caught my eye is what looks to be Ripto's necklace. Not only does this get me excited to finally be able to play as him after he got shafted from Nitrofield, but it also gets me thinking about what this could potentially mean for the next Spyro game. Now personally, I'm against the recycling of villains for Spyro 4, but that doesn't mean Ripto couldn't still be a part of the game. I think his inclusion would work fine if he were an antihero of some sort, reluctantly working with the protagonists in the same vein as Cortex in Crash 4. And adding him to the Crash Team Rumble roster would give us a chance to really see him in action and get a feel for what his moveset could be should he be playable in Spyro 4 as well. In addition to that, there is also a leaf symbol, which has gotten some people speculating that it could represent Elora. And while this one's not as absolute as the other two seem to be, it's a definite possibility and would be a damn good choice to include her in my opinion. After her small cameo at the end of Spyro 3, Elora sorta fell into obscurity in favor of other female characters, so this would be a great opportunity for her to get back in the spotlight. In fact, I briefly discussed what kind of moveset she could have in this video here, along with other characters I think should or should not return in the next game. Essentially, though it will remain largely Crash-centric, Rumble could serve as a way to test the waters for playable characters both new and old, and how they'll work in Spyro 4.